This is a warm welcome, let me tell you. I couldn't help that.
We were joking in the other room, which was nicely air conditioned, by the way, that this is a bit like a real 19th century talk with no air conditioning and the warmth. So, thank you all for coming out today. It's a pleasure to be here with Harold, and thank you for coming to Harrisburg and be a part of this talk.
My pleasure.
So let's just jump right in and talk about really why did you decide to choose this topic? You obviously written about Abraham Lincoln for most of your career, but why in this particular time, this particular topic?
I mean, it's a complicated answer. I made an arrangement to do this book in 2016 because of a presidential campaign which seemed tame by comparison to what we're going through now. A tame campaign, but constant complaints from the man who was elected about the press, right, and about immigrants. That's all we heard. And so I agreed to do two books, one about presidents and the press, which I did first, and then I kind of was obligated to do one more, and lo and behold, no one has solved the immigration crisis, which I question the term, but it's still out there. It's still a rancorous, divisive issue. And America is still the place that people from around the world want to come. And other aspects of Lincoln's career have been fully analyzed and redone by second and third generations of historians, and no one has really done immigration. So I thought, also I'm the grandson of 4 immigrants, so it appealed to me on that basis. They weren't exactly welcomed with open arms, but they made it. You know, they came from Europe, they survived. They wouldn't have survived had they remained in Europe. So I thought the positiveness of that experience was worth remembering 19th century as well.
And I'm also, obviously, most of us in here are probably children or grandchildren of immigrants. I have some Irish descent and a great-grandmother who came over and worked as a maid, which is very typical. So
and Lincoln did kind of make his peace with the Irish at a certain point, right?
Yeah, we'll get into that a little bit.
Wasn't crazy about them at the beginning, but
yeah.
They were Democrats. That's the problem.
So speaking of, what was Lincoln's ancestry? What was his background?
So he was of English background. And, you know, he didn't know a ton about his great, times 10 grandfather who came from a place called Hingham, England, and as a weaver's apprentice, and then settled in Hingham, Massachusetts. They named a village for their ancestral home. And then subsequent generations moved south to Virginia and then west into Kentucky. But he really didn't know the history. And of his mother's ancestry, we know nothing. She was possibly illegitimate, and the paternity was not known. And Lincoln always said, I don't care where my ancestors came from. I don't care where my grandparents came from. I only care where their grandson is going. And that's one way to say, I don't know. And also, in America, we don't care that much. Yeah.
Yes, interesting. So setting the table, the 19th century, what was immigration like in that antebellum period, really? From you specifically in the book talk about, I think, 1830 to about the beginning of the Civil War. Who was coming, why?
Well, first, the legal issue. There were almost no constraints, except for the John Adams era. Anyone could come. Obviously, Europeans were most welcome. Asians did not begin coming to California until the railroad and gold boom of the late 1840s and then the 1850s. But it's extraordinary. If you got here, you got off a ship, you registered, no one intimidated or inhibited you. All they required was your name, your place of origin, your gender, which was just simply to register. 5 years later, you could obtain citizenship papers without the kind of tests that are required today, which are really difficult tests, and probably 97% of Americans would not be able to pass. So that was an open door, no walls, no borders to speak of. The southern border, interestingly, when the United States won the war with Mexico and received an enormous amount of land, and the controversy started about slavery expansion, Lincoln was very on top of that. But he also favored the idea that any Mexican native trapped or dwelling within the Mexican cession, as it was known, could automatically apply for American citizenship without waiting. And he also favored, this is early Lincoln, military veterans 1 year of service, and you could become a citizen. So the Irish begin coming in, Irish Catholics come from the beginning of the 1840s on, but with increasing numbers when the potato famine strikes. So Ireland is the only country in Europe that loses population in the 19th century, net loss. And then in 1848, liberal democratic revolutions in Europe are put down by dictators and monarchies, so the Germans start coming. And 5 or 6 million people between 1840 and 1850. And then you get really the beginnings of anti-Catholic pushback, anti-Irish particularly in some of the big cities.
So again, nothing new under the sun. New immigrants, new problems. Technically, what's said by the as you put it in the book, or they were called Native Americans, which you read it for the first time in the 21st century, it throws you off what you're talking about. You're obviously not talking about who we consider Native Americans, but people born, white people principally, in the United States. And you talk about that now, that friction that was developing.
Well, not far from here in Philadelphia, in 1844. Nativists organized a opposition to a Catholic request to read from a Catholic Bible at the beginning of mandated prayer in the public schools. The result was nativists putting up speakers' platforms in Kensington, which was an Irish area of Philadelphia, and railing against the Pope taking over the United States. Irishmen jumped on the stage, knocked them down. 2-day riot, mayhem, burning of 2 churches, about 50 people killed, the National Guard was called. This happened in other cities too, New York, Boston. But the Philadelphia outrage precipitated meetings by Whigs all over the country because they were being blamed for the hostility to the Irish. Because the Irish were joining the Democratic Party in droves, and the Whigs were hostile to the opposition, and maybe hostile to the Catholics as well. So Lincoln makes his first statement about immigration in 1844 when he's 35 years old and says nothing should be put in the way of anyone who wants to enter the United States. And publicly, he's pretty consistent with that position for the rest of his life.
So, as you mentioned, the beginning of Lincoln's views, and you do write also that it does evolve, as everything with Abraham Lincoln seems to over his life, which is a noble thing, to be able to change your mind and to think. So
they didn't call it flip-flopping. They called it evolving. Right.
Well, perhaps. But can you, again, maybe go a little detail about his experience with immigrants before his political world, and then how that changed as he became more of a political character?
So I'm not sure he knew any immigrants for the longest time. Had an Irish-American school teacher once. He visited New Orleans once, which was an international city even when he was 20 years old. Irish immigrants, Swedish immigrants begin arriving in Springfield in the early 1840s, around the time when he moves there and gets married there, and his wife begins employing. You said your ancestor was an Irish domestic. Mary Lincoln begins employing and possibly abusing Irish maids. She smacked them around a little, but so some of them remembered. The earliest immigrants with whom Lincoln is acquainted are the early Germans, some Catholic, but Gustav Kerner, a German Whig-turned-Republican who comes to Illinois in the 1830s, he's a big character in my book, becomes lieutenant governor of Illinois, even though he's born in Germany. And really the other person with whom Lincoln is close and sort of forgotten by history, is a man named William de Fleurville, but he takes the name William Flourville in Illinois. He is a barber born in Haiti and comes through Illinois. He's a man of color. I mean, on an obvious and preliminary level, he's Lincoln's barber. He's the guy who says, okay, you don't want to grow your beard? I'll trim it and make it nice. I mean, you want to grow your beard out after he's elected. But Flourville is also a property owner in Springfield, which is a surprisingly integrated city in the 1850s. I was surprised to learn about that years ago. And Flourville is his legal client. And then Lincoln helps him when his free son is, I guess, kidnapped is the way to put it, and imprisoned in the South, and accused of being a runaway slave when the Fugitive Slave Act was completely out of control. And Lincoln was part of a group of Springfielders who helped liberate, and they had to pay off they had to buy his freedom, and he was a free young man. Anyway, so eventually Lincoln gets to know many, many German Americans because they're anti-slavery Republicans. The closest Irishman was a man who helped Abraham and Mary rekindle their romance after they'd broken up. His name was James Shields. And the reason he was instrumental is because he was a Democrat and a prominent Democrat. And when Lincoln was courting Mary again, Mary was engaged with a girlfriend in writing satires about James Shields, anti-Irish satires. So Lincoln said, well, you know, the way back into her heart is to help her and make them even worse. So they wrote a satire of James Shields that he thought he was the women's favorite guy, but he really is terrible with women. He never bathes. He's drunk all the time, typical anti-Irish stuff. And James Shields demanded to know who wrote it. And the editor of the paper in which the satire was published asked Lincoln what to do. Lincoln said, give him my name. And Shields challenged Lincoln to a duel. And they went out to an island in the Mississippi River called Bloody Island. It no longer exists. The accretion of the river buried Bloody Island.
Appropriate name for
well, it was named that because that's where Illinoisans went to duel.
Because it was across the river?
Because it was across the river in Missouri. So
where it was legal?
Where it was legal. So Lincoln goes, but people could be arrested when they got back to Illinois. So I don't quite get it, but they actually get to Bloody Island, and Lincoln, as the challenged party, has the right to choose weapons, and he chooses broadswords, big swords, and then he practices shearing off the branches of low-hanging branches of trees. And only then did Shields say, maybe we ought to shake hands and just forget this. Shields later becomes United States Senator, and Lincoln unseats him in 1855. But I know we haven't gotten to the war yet, but when we get to the war, I'll tell you what became of that relationship.
I found that to be such a fascinating, when you read the book, if you haven't read it yet, that's a fascinating story. And you could just see Lincoln with that broadsword swinging all, how tall was he, 6'4"?
6'4".
And I don't know how tall Shields was, but he certainly wasn't 6'4".
He's not 6'4".
But a fascinating story about 1842, and they were called the Rebecca Letters, right?
The Rebecca Letters.
Yeah,
Aunt Rebecca. That was Lincoln's nom de plume for the series, right?
So getting back to Lincoln in politics a little bit, as he's coming up, he starts, of course, his political career as a Whig, but he also, and then eventually becomes a Republican, but there's also, at least he's courting the Know-Nothings. And can you tell us who they were and what he was trying to achieve with the Know-Nothings?
So the Know-Nothing movement arises out of these nativist anti-Catholic impulses, but by the 1850s, it's an organized movement, a big movement, so-called because allegedly, if you knocked on the door of a meeting, which sounded like fun, what's going on in here? I should get into this. The person would answer the door, and the inquisitive interloper would say, what's happening in there? And they say, I know nothing. And so the nativists got this weird new name. By 1856, they ran a third-party candidate for president and got 23% of the vote. That is a big third-party movement. the result of that movement was James Buchanan being elected president and, doing nothing to prevent secession.
Pennsylvania's own.
Pennsylvania's own. But Lancaster, you don't take blame for
That's
Lancaster, right?
Over there somewhere.
Right. Lincoln. So this is the one moment where Lincoln is not kind of a pure pro-immigration person. He wants to build the anti-slavery movement. When the Whig Party dies out, the Republican Party forms. Lincoln wants know-nothings to abandon their hostility to Catholics and build their anti-slavery predilections by joining the Republicans. So Lincoln never really condemns the know-nothing movement. He says in a famous letter, "I am not a know-nothing, how could I be?" But he writes that privately. And I think biographers have misused that letter.
Oh, how so?
By claiming that it's Lincoln's rejection of the know-nothings. It's a rejection of the know-nothings to his best friend in Kentucky, who doesn't publish it until a year after Lincoln's dead. So it's not a public statement. If you read Lincoln's letters to other friends, he's saying, I want Native Americans. I want Americans. The know-nothings rebranded themselves as the American Party. But what their platform was no citizenship until 21 years of residence. And no foreign-born person can ever hold any elective office in the United States. Should Lincoln have been condemning that? Yeah, probably. When pushed to the wall, he would object. But never. In fact, in 1860, when he ran for president, he was accused of secretly attending know-nothing meetings. And he had to orchestrate a denial campaign. It's kind of like Lincoln's position on slavery. It's evolutionary, right? More than revolutionary. He hates slavery, but until 1862, he only wants to limit, or publicly says he wants to limit its expansion and have it die out with no slave trade. But of course, it was never going to die out. But that was his position. And on immigration, it was, yes, we should continue with open borders, but maybe, don't attack the people who are anti-Catholic. It's tough to trace.
It is, and he's sort of the consummate politician. And
Exactly.
he really was. He played both sides against each other if he had to, and would take that middle ground, which not everyone liked, especially abolitionists, but certainly as he went through the war and his situations evolved. And getting back to the immigration piece, he also, and also with slavery, he also was someone who advocated colonization for a long time.
Yeah, and did not see the irony at all. Is there not irony about saying anyone can come in, but let's invite people to go out? He didn't see that irony. In the same way, he did not see the irony of having no sympathy at all for indigenous people. Lincoln was for containment and settlement, or worse. He did have a famous meeting with Indian chiefs in the White House, which I write about in the book. I found a way to do it because he had gone to a German opera and met the actors, the singers backstage, and said to them, "You must come to the White House one day." And one of them, who didn't speak great English, thought it was an invitation to come the next day. So this German spear carrier, who is appearing at the Washington Theater, the National Theater, walks to the White House, and no security. He just goes into the East Room, and there are 20 of the most important chiefs of tribes in the country sitting, cross-legged on the floor. And Lincoln is lecturing them with a globe, telling them about the rest of the world. I got to write about that scene. So Lincoln Lincoln's grandfather, Abraham Lincoln, was killed by a Native American, and his father was nearly killed. The warrior had an axe raised, hatchet raised, and the little boy's older brother, shot the Indian before he could kill Thomas Lincoln, or there would be no Lincoln. The only military experience Lincoln had later as a young man was in an Indian war against Chief Black Hawk of the Sauk Nation, who re-entered Illinois. He had so it's part of the complexity of Lincoln. In fact, toward the end of his life, Lincoln opened up homestead lands, free land in the West, to the foreign-born before they became citizens, because he wanted to encourage immigration at that point. But did he realize that there were lands that were native lands in recent memory? No, he didn't see it. So, again, complex story.
Yeah, very interesting and typical too of the times.
Yeah.
He was a very typical. So speaking of, you mentioned the war. Let's get up to the war. Lincoln obviously wins election in 1860. He enters the White House. Confederate States begin to secede. Sumter is bombarded, and then the war breaks out. And one thing you point out, I think, pretty clearly is that he absolutely thought he needed to recruit both Republicans and Democrats, people from different perspectives, to join the Army. I'm sure officers as well as enlisted. You talk about what drove him to that decision?
Well, he did not want it to be an exclusively Republican war. He thought if it was waged that way, it would be supported by only the 39% of the voting public who had voted for him. He didn't even get 40% in the popular vote in 1860. And I'm not sure that he believed that recruitment would work across party and ethnic lines. But he determined to get Democrats involved. And then, a week after the bombardment of Sumter, 150,000 people rallied at Union Square in New York. And it was two rallies. It was a Blue Blood rally, of Roosevelts and Rensselaers on one side of the park. And on the west side of the park, the southern border of the park, it was Irish and German speakers who said, we love our old country, but that's our flag. They actually had the flag from Sumter flying from the statue of George Washington that some of you may know, the big equestrian statue. That flag was traduced, their favorite word. It was shot down. It was dragged in the mud. And we will defend. One Irish speaker says, it's worse than if the British fleet had come here. So Lincoln,
which for an Irishman is saying something at that time.
It's a big thing. So Lincoln is emboldened to ask the Bishop of New York, John Hughes, to suggest some nominees among the Irish. One of them is James Shields. So Lincoln says, well, I know we're not buddies. Maybe he doesn't remember the duel. And he summons him from California. He recruits Michael Corcoran in New York. Corcoran was under court-martial because he had refused to assemble the Irish Brigade to welcome the Prince of Wales to New York. I'm not welcoming the heir to the throne that dominates my native land. Thomas Francis Meagher, another one, was a prisoner, an escapee from Tasmania or Australia who had been banned by the British. So it was, and then on the German side, Franz Sigel in Missouri, and Pennsylvania's own Alexander Schimmelpfennig, the best name in the Civil War. And 1 hour from here, Alexander Schimmel. It's a problem with all these guys. Well, the good news was that they were recruiting magnets. They were poster boys for fellow Irishmen and Germans. The bad news is that they actually had to fight, and they didn't do so well. So with Sigel, it was "I Fight mit Sigel" was was a song title, like 5 or 6 songs, posters. But then he demonstrated that the only real skill he had was retreating well. So he became known as the Flying Dutchman, which is not quite the same thing as "I Fight mit Sigel." Schimmelpfennig, who was from Philadelphia at that point, by way of Germany, was the leader of a brigade, a corps, on the first day at Gettysburg, right? An hour by car from here or less. And they were retreating through the town of Gettysburg. And as some of you know who know the war, they got up into the Round Tops and Cemetery Hill, and they protected that high ground on the second day. But Schimmelpfennig had made a sharp right turn before they went up into the heights, and found an alleyway, and then he was going to leap over a fence, but the fence was too high, so he hid under a porch in a pigsty for 2 days more. We actually have a friend who lives next door, the artist Wendy Allen, who is the best Lincoln artist in the country. And that's, Carl Schurz, the most famous German American of his time, who also fought at Gettysburg, came triumphantly through town after the battle and saw Schimmelfennig, and he said, "Alec, we thought you were dead." And he said, "No, I was just over, in the pigsty." Reputationally, he was dead. James Shields ran into a dueling opponent who was a little more formidable than Lincoln, Stonewall Jackson. So eventually these guys did not do well in the service, but they served their principal purpose.
And you
24% of the Union Army is foreign born.
Yep.
It's just amazing. It's more than a foreign legion. It's a quarter of the force.
Absolutely, and I believe that you share there's about 175,000 Germans and about
I think it's
150,000
higher now.
Irish.
I think I was too
Really?
low with the
Okay.
Germans.
Which surprised me. I always thought that the Irish had just because of the fame, I guess, of the Irish Brigade and all that there may be more Irish than the Germans. But also in general, at least the Irish were more democratic, and
They were more
Germans were
democratic.
more German, or Germans were more
Lincoln
German.
was a great believer, long before Lincoln approved establishment of the so-called U.S. colored troops. He was a big believer in ethnic unity, right? It's separation. He thought that Irishmen should fight with Irishmen. He thought that Germans should fight with Germans. And I think his original idea of people of color fighting with other black volunteers was that not so much that the service had to be segregated, but that they inspire each other. And he believed it across the board. Swedish regiments, Irish regiments, German regiments. When Marr wants to form another regiment, he asks Lincoln permission after Bull Run, and Lincoln says, "Okay, if it's all Irish." So that was, and Lincoln, in 3 years, he goes from a guy who believes that Irishmen are being imported into Illinois to cast fake votes against him, to a person who goes to the green regimental flag and takes it in his hand with tears running down his cheek and says, "God bless the Irish flag," because they're Union men.
There was also a great story that you shared. I believe it was one of the Irish brigades that was also in, I guess, Arlington Heights, I think it was, and they got back, and their term in this case, their 3-month term was about to expire. Is that the story you were just sharing, more or less? Yeah.
Well, that was the problem. Everybody was recruited for 90 or 100 days, and they join in April. Bull Run is July, and the Irish Brigade goes home with Marr. Corcoran is captured. Marr is the second in command. And Lincoln goes out to Fort Corcoran in Arlington Heights. So it was supposed to be called Fort Seward, but the Irish soldiers said, "No, we're naming it for one of our own." And they had a priest bless the artillery, which Bishop Hughes did not like. He replaced
That's right. Got in
priests.
some trouble for that.
Yeah. Lincoln went out with Seward to Fort Corcoran and asked the men in a public speech, "Will you re-enlist?" And they did. They formed another Irish brigade and another and another.
He also had a Lincoln midway through the war around 1863 in his annual message, which is essentially the State of the Union today. He makes some proposals about immigration, and it's really the first time, I think, in American history that it's looked at in a positive light, I guess,
And one of the last. by the way.
one of the last. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so comes out of his visit to this state. He speaks at Gettysburg. He comes home with smallpox, takes to his bed. He's sick for about 2 weeks, but he still has to do the annual message. It's not like President Biden postponed the State of the Union, right, by 4 weeks. He couldn't do that then. Had to be the first day that the Congress returns, and in those days it was December. And Lincoln was obligated to do it, and he proposed an act to encourage immigration. Build up the landing depots in Boston and New York. Have the first Federal Bureau of Immigration, not to constrain, not to restrict, but to ease the path, inform people, have reforms about conditions on ships, because the steerage conditions were deadly in many cases. And finally, and the most revolutionary proposal was the federal government. Now, just in context, Lincoln's not like having an epiphany because he's a great guy. He's a great guy, but there have been like 350,000 deaths of men by December of '63. Now, white and black men fighting for the Union, and people who were sick and people who were wounded, amputees. And as Lincoln says, the army force is depleted, and we need people for the farms, the factories, and the mines. So his proposal is, and just think of this in context of today's debate, that the federal government should pay for the ocean voyages of poor immigrants. Even the Republican Congress says that's a bridge too far. They do create a mechanism to encourage private industry to create a loan program and like a 5-year period to repay. Very American, very capitalistic, but that's what Lincoln wanted.
Like
by
indentured
1860.
servitude, isn't it? More or less?
Yeah. And July 4th is the 160th anniversary of the day Lincoln signed this act. He wanted to wait until July 4th because of something he had said on another July 4th in 1858. Could I just say that quickly? So Lincoln is invited, well, I'll skip that, it takes too long. July 4th, 1858, the beginning of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Douglas speaks, and Lincoln comes the next morning, so it's not an official debate, in Chicago. And Lincoln begins to talk about July 4th, about the founding fathers, about the founding generation. He looks in the crowd, and he sees people he knows, German leaders, some Irish who are there to heckle him. And he says, I see in this crowd not only people who were the blood of the revolution, the blood of the founding generation, but those who have come here more recently. Germans, Irish, Swedes. He names the ethnicities by name. And I just want you to know that you are also entitled to be the blood of the revolution, because the Declaration guarantees that. So, not to be political, I'm just being historical, Lincoln never said that refugees or migrants were poisoning the blood of America. He said they were enriching the blood of America. So 1864, he signs the act, and it's the last pro-immigration bill until Lyndon Johnson's immigration reform of 1965. And now it's from 1965 to 2024, complete paralysis on the issue.
Which is, in some cases, looking back at the historical narrative, traditional in this country to do that.
Right.
And one final question before we get to the question and answer, and it is just about Lincoln's legacy. I assume that's one of his most enduring legacies related to immigration. But are there any others that you want to share with us?
I think the enduring legacy is that his belief was that America was, now admittedly, it's a big country with a smaller population. It's beset by death in a war of his making, but and his vision did not necessarily include Latinos or Asians. He even signed a bill that was remarkably called the Cooley Exclusion Act. Talk about a direct and offensive law. But he believed that Asians were being brought here almost under slave trade conditions and wanted to allegedly protect. But for the vision of building the labor force, building new Americans, I think it's a legacy of inclusion and open arms that, and it's just sort of a vanished part of his legacy. I'm not saying he focused on it as much as he did on emancipation, on black recruitment, on the war, but it was a part of that tradition and a neglected part of his legacy. And I didn't even know the extent of it when I started the book, kind of for sentimental reasons. it's an astounding second story about Abraham Lincoln.
Well, you close the book, or at least pretty close to the end, with a quote by W.E.B. Du Bois. And I'll just share this, and then we can open up to questions. And I think it sums up Abraham Lincoln rather well. And Du Bois wrote, "The scars and foibles and contradictions of the great do not diminish but enhance the worth and meaning of their upward struggle. Lincoln was a man, a big, inconsistent, brave man who steadily evolved upwards." Wish they could say that for everyone, that we all steadily evolve upwards. Harold, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and I'll come around with the mic. We'll go here and then here.
I really enjoyed your Shield stories. I'd never heard that episode about the duel before.
Because every time someone went to the White House and said, "Didn't you have a duel once with Senator Shields?" And he said, "If you ever want to get invited back here, don't mention it." He wanted it suppressed.
Well, I've read biographies and I don't recall it ever coming up. Is that possible?
It's in a few. It's excluded from many. Certainly, 19th century biographies did not do it because Lincoln's friends wanted it. Dueling was a bad stain on reputation after the Jackson era. But yes.
The question relates to Shields, but it's what I thought I heard you say, and just confirm whether or not you said that in 1855, Lincoln unseated U.S. Senator Shields?
Yeah.
I have never heard that. Tell us what happened.
So Lincoln wanted to be a senator the cycle before the Lincoln-Douglas debate cycle. And I call it 55 because the popular vote didn't count for senators until the 20th century. The legislatures of states selected senators. So even though there were Lincoln-Douglas debates, they were just fighting to elect state senators and state assembly members. In 55, Lincoln goes into the legislative session. James Shields is the Democratic senator. Lincoln is the overwhelming favorite to win. He gets this close, but he does manage to gather a big opposition vote to Shields. Lincoln starts to fade in the later ballots and eventually transfers his support to a man named Lyman Trumbull. Trumbull was elected senator, but by virtue of Lincoln's coming into the legislature as a favorite, Shields' Senate career is, at least from Illinois, is ended. He actually becomes the only man to represent 3 states in the United States Senate. And his statue, he's in Statuary Hall from one of those. The last Senate term was very brief, but 3 different states. Trivia, I got a lot of it.
You spoke quite a bit about Catholics and Lincoln's view towards them and their role in the war. Could you talk about the people with the Jewish faith? What was Lincoln's view of them, and what role did they play during the war?
So, in line with the old joke, some of my best friends were Jewish, Lincoln did have Jewish friends in Illinois. Abraham Jonas was his first early friend of the Jewish faith. He was a Whig with 11 or 12 children from Quincy, Illinois. He's the man who pushed back against the rumors that he had been in a Know-Nothing lodge in Quincy. He eventually appoints Jonas a postmaster. They remain close. His closest Jewish associate was Dr. Issachar Zachary, a podiatrist. And I've learned this year how important podiatrists are. Man, they are crucial. Lincoln had terrible foot problems. We don't know the specific, but he did say corns at one point. This guy scraped his feet and gave him fitted special boots for his size 17 feet. And Zachary, he tried to get Zachary appointed podiatrist or chiropodist, they called it, to the Union Army. And let him be sort of an emissary to Jewish voters in 1864. Okay, that's some of my best friends are Jewish, but the 2 big things, policy-wise, one, when rabbis came to Lincoln early in the war and said, Jewish chaplains are not allowed by federal law. You have to be a minister of a Christian denomination. Lincoln fought to have the law changed. Took a year, but eventually it was of some faith. So they were the first Jewish chaplains were serving in the Civil War. And then the most famous and important example comes when Grant issues the infamous Order Number 11, banning all Jews from his command, which was vast. And he thought he was just banning peddlers. But it said Jews as a class are banned from this theater of the war. And it actually started a pogrom in Paducah, Kentucky, with Jewish people leaving. Rabbis came to see Lincoln again, and Lincoln quietly, without rebuking Grant publicly, because Grant was the only general who was winning battles, he countermanded the order and told Grant's superior officer that it was un-American.
Lincoln's personal religious position is notoriously vague. So would you say that that informed his position on a number of these issues?
You know, that's a really good point. Get me rewrite for the book. Yeah, I think it certainly was important regarding his relations with Jews, because Jewish people came away with the idea that he was kind of a Jeffersonian deist, that he believed in a higher power, but was never, baptized. And did he accept Jesus as his savior? No one is sure that he did. So it kept him kind of ecumenical and open. I think that's a really great point. But he became, we were talking about evolution, right? Evolution-wise, he becomes more and more religious, not formally, not church-going, but more believes increasingly in a will of God ordaining that the war continue. Because I think he can't accept responsibility for $750,000 deaths. It's more than any mortal can absorb. And the day, his cabinet rejected or kind of pushed him into stopping the emancipation on July 22nd, which was the date he wanted to issue it in 1862. Oh, we have an off-year election coming up. We'll be slaughtered. We haven't won battles. It'll be considered a desperation move. So Lincoln withdrew it. And after the Battle of Antietam, reintroduced it to his cabinet and said, before we discuss this, I want you to know that I made a pact with God that if we won that battle, the proclamation would be issued. And the promise having been made, freedom will be delivered. So he did turn to God, but rejected specific disciplines of any church.
So I think this is on, yes. Let me ask you the question. I mean, at the beginning of the war, you had lots of interest in people signing up, but as the war went on and the draft started taking place, and you had the New York riots, which were largely Catholic and Irish, how did Lincoln react to those?
First with a joke, right? I don't think Lincoln knew the seriousness of the draft riots in the early days, even though they took place in the communications capital of the world. His son was on his way back to Washington from Harvard. He stopped in New York, and he sort of saw all this activity, and he stayed an extra day and a half. Drove Lincoln crazy. Not because he was particularly worried about the riots, but because his wife had been injured in a carriage accident. The wound had become infected, and she was in serious trouble, and Lincoln couldn't pay attention. He wanted Robert to come back from New York. Anyway, that's just a theory of mine. Yes, it was an almost exclusively Irish riot, and it was, I have maintained, a race riot, not an anti-draft riot, and it resulted in horrendous things, lynchings, sexual mutilation, drowning people, driving people off the docks of New York. I mean, it was brutal. The Democratic press fomented that riot. So it was also a political riot. Don't fight. You've suffered enough. don't fight for black people's freedom. That's not what we signed up for. We signed up to save the Union. And this went on for weeks. No excuses, but it, again, was also complicated. Oh, so Lincoln's joke. I know the perfect general to send to quell the draft riot. General Kilpatrick. And get it, right? It took his audience, even the people who listened, Kilpatrick. And then he realized it kind of laid an egg, so he had General John Adams Dix, who was a descendant of the founding generation, put down the riots. And some Gettys, Pennsylvania troops, too.
We have time for a couple more questions.
They have one here and one there.
I'm bouncing back and forth with the Passenger Act and also the open borders. Was that Lincoln's, Lincoln allowed that? And then you have, again, like I said, the Passenger Act, then the birthright citizenship. And you talked about those borders being open and anyone can come in.
Anyone could come in. I mean, we can't credit him with birthright citizenship. That's post-war in the 14th Amendment, but it's all of a piece, right? And yes, the remarkable thing is that the borders they were not sealed. There were no ICE people. There was no customs. Well, I guess there was customs. There was no whatever the enforcement is for people. It was completely open. And eventually, so many Chinese come to California, so many Irishmen come to Boston and New York that there's pushback by people who'd been here 20 years or 100 years before. But what no one says in the current debate, I won't take sides in the current debate, but the Constitution does not give the federal government the right to control immigration, just citizenship. So they can set the Congress can set the terms for swearing loyalty to become a citizen. But the rate of immigration was left inferentially to the states. So the states sometimes did like a dollar a head tax for immigrants to deter impoverished people who might become burdens on the state. But it's just hard to believe that it was open season and kind of a welcome mat. Some people try to pull away the mat at the last minute, but the mat was there.
A little off topic, but I've always been curious. Had Lincoln been able to serve his second time to the fullest, do you think really things would have changed that much?
There's always one question too many in these sessions. No, I get asked that a lot. You know, I don't love counterfactual history and, imposing my kind of semi-informed view. But so here's what I think. Likely, Lincoln was moving slowly on black rights in 1865. He endorsed the 13th Amendment. He made it part of his reelection platform. He pushed, as we all know from the movie, right, the Lincoln movie, he pushed Congress hard, the House of Representatives hard, because they had failed to advance the resolution to the states. He made sure they did. If he had to bribe people, it was okay. He had to promise them jobs, it was okay. And in his last speech, he didn't know it was his last speech, April 11th, 1865, he stood up the window in the White House and he said, among other things, it was a Reconstruction speech, and he said, I think it's time to give the vote to black men, especially those who have, especially the very intelligent and those who have fought in the army. Now, if we look at that today, we say, oh, what is he saying? It's means testing. What does he mean, intelligent? But it's the first time an American president ever said that black men had the right, and of course not women, black men had the right to vote. And John Wilkes Booth is in the audience, and he turns to one of his co-conspirators and said, that means Negro equality. And he doesn't use the word Negro. That's the last speech he'll ever make. And 3 days later, he shot him because he feared Lincoln's leadership in moving toward a biracial society. Obviously, Johnson was his biggest mistake as a running mate, although he doesn't really have direct footprints or fingerprints, whatever it is, on the selection, because it was always done by the convention. I think he wanted Johnson. And, but of course, he believed in his own immortality, as Roosevelt did in 1944, and presidents tend to do. So getting to the bottom line, I think he might have moved more slowly on the 14th and 15th Amendments. Voting rights, birthright, civil rights, the civil rights law, than the so-called radical, which was really the progressive Congress did. And Johnson resisted, of course, leading to his impeachment. But I think it would have happened more permanently if Lincoln was there. And not to sound glib, but if he had been there for all of the 1860s, there might have been less work to do in the 1960s. All that work postponed. All of that work deferred through Wilson and the others who fought back and allowed Jim Crow and all of that. So, I don't know. I think he would have infuriated Frederick Douglass. He would have infuriated Charles Sumner. But then when you look back in 1869, maybe they would have counted real
Thaddeus Stevens.
Yeah, and Thaddeus Stevens.
Based on your knowledge or research of Abraham Lincoln, sorry about that.
I see you.
What would you identify as specific Lincoln traits, Lincoln characteristics that caused him to rise to the top at the Chicago Convention in 1860?
Well, Chicago was probably more hard-boiled politics than character. The genius of Lincoln's success, or his people's success at that convention, was that he did not give offense, allegedly, to others. He was everyone's second choice. And William Seward faltered after leading on the first ballot. By the way, most historians say William Seward faltered because he was too radical an anti-slavery man. He had said that the conflict over slavery is an irrepressible conflict, so he could never have won the presidency. Well, Lincoln said it was a house divided. So I don't think that makes any sense. Just because Lincoln's comment was biblically, could be traced to the Bible. I think Seward lost because he was much better on immigration at that time than Lincoln was. He had condemned the know-nothings. Lincoln had been kind of flirting with them. So when it came to swing states like Illinois and Indiana, the hope was a guy like Lincoln can get German votes, and he can also get anti-immigrant votes, which he did. So anyway, how did he get it? He got it through really a lot of luck, a lot of Germans who switched to Lincoln, by the way, a lot of promises of cabinet positions to those who were coming in third and fourth. I mean, your own guy down the street, right, Simon Cameron, he thought he was going to get the Treasury Department. That would have not been a smart thing to give Cameron the Treasury Department. But he got the War Department as I don't want to say a payoff, but as an inducement to get Pennsylvania to switch its ballots. But what did people know about Lincoln? Because you asked about character as well as politics. His honesty was the thing that everybody talked about. Honest Abe was a nickname that everybody knew, who knew Lincoln. Not everybody knew him in 1860. And also the humor. We don't, I think it's kind of a lost thing in American politics, the kind of humor that Lincoln had, and Roosevelt and Kennedy. For those of you old enough to remember Kennedy, he was pretty funny at his press conferences and other things. Whatever the politics, there was a sense of self-effacement. His modesty was well known. That's another virtue we don't hear too much about anymore. So I think that's what got him there. Also, his speaking ability. Those debates were reprinted everywhere in the United States. So if they knew anything about Lincoln, they knew that. What was understressed, or what is the word? What sort of de-emphasized was Lincoln's stated determination to absolutely prevent the spread of slavery. If you read all of the campaign biographies that are rushed into print in the summer of 1860, they emphasize he rose from a log cabin. He split rails with his own hand. He piloted a flatboat down the Mississippi River. He's really strong. He's tough. He's honest. And he's gigantic. You know, that's what they stress. So this image was one of the first all-image, to the extent that he could keep it that way, political campaigns.
We've got to wrap up. Can we give Harold and Jeffrey one more round of applause? Thank you to Harold, and congratulations on the new book. Thank you to Jeffrey. Thank you to the National Civil War Museum. We're going to have a book signing over here at this table. We've got books available for purchase up at the cafe. Thanks for coming out, everyone. Have a good night.